There is a specific kind of loneliness that nobody talks about. Not the loneliness of an empty apartment on a Friday night. Not the loneliness of having no one to call. But the loneliness that arrives in the middle of a dinner table, surrounded by people you've known for years, and still feeling, somewhere deep inside, completely unseen. You're there, you're present, you're even smiling. And yet, there are people who can walk into a room full of familiar faces and feel, within minutes, like a ghost. Not because they're ignored, not because anyone is being cruel, but because the version of them that everyone sees, and responds to, and laughs with, is not quite them. It's close, it's functional, it's recognizable, but it's not the whole thing. Some people describe it as watching life through glass. Everyone else seems to be inside the room, warm, connected, easy with each other, and you're pressing your face against the window, seeing everything clearly, but touching almost none of it. This experience has a name, even if no one has ever offered it to you directly. It's called felt invisibility, and it's one of the quietest, most misunderstood forms of loneliness that exists. It's not weakness, it's not arrogance, it's not a failure to try harder or smile wider or speak more freely. It's something far more interesting than that, and far more human. There is a real psychology behind why certain people can stand in the center of a group and still feel profoundly, privately alone. That's what we're here to explore today. Some people move through social environments the way water moves through water. Frictionless, natural, absorbed. For them, presence in a room means presence in the conversation. Being there means being felt by the people around them. But there are others, and if you're watching this, you may be one of them, for whom presence in a room means something entirely different. It means performing, adjusting, translating yourself into a version that the room can hold. And the exhausting part isn't the performance itself. The exhausting part is that nobody around you seems to notice it's happening. They think they know you. They might even love you, and you don't doubt that. But what they love is the version you've learned to show. Careful, edited, acceptable. The deeper version, the one that notices everything, that feels things in layers, that thinks thoughts too slow or too strange or too vulnerable to speak out loud. That version stays quiet. That version waits. This is where most people completely misunderstand what's happening. They assume that felt invisibility is about shyness, or social anxiety, or not trying hard enough to open up. But the people who feel this way are often not shy at all. Many of them are warm, thoughtful, even talkative in the right context. The issue isn't communication. The issue is depth. The issue is that their inner world runs at a frequency that most social environments never actually tune into. Carl Jung spent much of his life thinking about what he called the inner life, the rich, complex interior world that certain people carry, almost like a second universe, running parallel to the visible one. Jung believed that for people with a strong inner life, the outer world is never quite enough on its own, not because they reject it, but because they are always, instinctively, comparing what's on the surface with what they sense underneath. They walk into a room and feel the tension no one is naming. They hear what's not being said. They register the emotional weather of a space before a single word is spoken. This sensitivity is a gift, but it also means they experience every social environment at a level of complexity that most people around them simply aren't operating at. And that gap between how deeply they perceive and how little of that depth is ever reflected back is precisely where felt invisibility is born. Think about a family dinner. There are people who arrive, sit down, eat, talk about ordinary things, the weather, work, someone's new car, and leave feeling fine, satisfied even. And then there are others who sit at that same table and feel something quietly painful throughout the entire meal. Not because anything went wrong, but because the conversation never once touched the part of them that's actually alive. Nobody asked what they've been thinking about lately. Not really. Nobody noticed the shift in their expression when a certain topic came up. Nobody wondered what was underneath the polite answers. They were there for 2 hours, and they left feeling like they hadn't arrived at all. or think about a workplace. There are people who fit into office culture the way a key fits a lock. The casual jokes land, the small talk feels natural, the group lunch is easy, and then there are others who sit in the same meetings, contribute the same ideas, laugh at the same moments, and return to their desk afterward feeling somehow more alone than before they walked in. Not hostile, not resentful, just quietly unfound. The word unfound is important here, because the experience isn't always about being excluded or rejected. Sometimes it's about something more subtle and more painful, being present without being reached. You can be in the room, you can be seen with the eyes, you can be known by name, by role, by habit and history, and still feel, in the most honest part of yourself, that no one has ever quite found you. I want to tell you about someone. I'll call her Mara. Mara was, by every external measure, not alone. She had colleagues she liked, a family that loved her, a small group of friends she'd known since university. And yet she told me once, quietly, as if confessing something shameful, that the loneliest she ever felt was not during the years she lived alone in a small apartment in her late 20s. The loneliest she ever felt was at her own birthday party. She described standing in her own kitchen, surrounded by people who had shown up for her, and feeling a strange dissociation, like watching a film of her own life from a seat in the back row. People were laughing. Someone told a story about her that was kind and funny and true. She smiled, but inside, she had the distinct and hollow feeling that the person they were celebrating, the one they knew and loved, was a character she had written, not a lie, just incomplete. And she thought, if they really knew me, the whole of me, would they still be here? That question, that single quiet question. I think it lives inside many people who experience felt invisibility. Not do they like me, but would they still like me if they could actually see me? And because that question is never answered, because the deeper self is never fully offered, never fully witnessed, the invisibility continues, not imposed from outside, but quietly, carefully, maintained from within. Here is where we need to go one layer deeper, because something important appears. Felt invisibility is rarely random. It almost always has a history. Most people who live with this experience learned, at some point, often early, often in ways that were never spoken out loud, that their full self was somehow too much, too sensitive, too intense, too serious, too strange for the room they were in. Maybe they were the child who cried at things no one else seemed to feel, the teenager who asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, the young adult who felt things deeply in environments that quietly rewarded numbness and surface. And slowly, not in one dramatic moment, but over years of small corrections and sideways glances and conversations that died too soon, they learned to edit themselves. Jung called this the development of the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the world's expectations of us. Everyone develops a persona to some degree. It's not pathological, it's adaptive. But for deeply sensitive people, the persona can become so well constructed, so habitual, so automatic, that even they begin to lose track of where it ends and the real self begins. They become skilled at being the version of themselves that rooms can accept. And in doing so, they inadvertently make themselves invisible, not to others, but to the possibility of being truly, fully seen. They protect themselves so thoroughly that the protection becomes the cage. This is not a character flaw, it is a form of intelligence. If you grew up in an environment where emotional depth was met with impatience, where your sensitivity was called drama, your questions were called overthinking, your need for quiet was labeled antisocial, then learning to hide those things was smart. It kept you safe, it kept the peace, it kept you loved, at least on the surface. The tragedy is not that you built those protections. The tragedy is that you may have been carrying them so long, in so many rooms, across so many years, that you've forgotten you have a choice about when to put them down. And more than that, you may have forgotten that there are spaces, and people and moments where putting them down is not dangerous, where it is in fact the only way anything real can begin. But here's the part almost no one explains, and it matters deeply. There is a place where most people who feel invisible finally stop performing, and that place is solitude. When you are alone, truly alone, without an audience, without the quiet pressure to translate yourself, something shifts. You stop editing, you stop adjusting. The mask comes off not dramatically, but naturally, the way tension leaves a face when no one is watching. And in that quiet, many people who feel invisible in groups discover something paradoxical and profound. They feel most real when they are alone. Not because they don't want connection, not because other people don't matter to them, but because solitude is often the only environment where their full self is consistently allowed to exist. No performance required, no acceptable version needed, just the actual self, complex, layered, slow, sensitive, moving through its own interior world without apology. This is why many deeply introspective people feel, somewhat guiltily, that their most meaningful company is their own. Not out of arrogance, out of relief. Thoreau understood this with unusual clarity. He wrote, "I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude." People often read that line as the words of a misanthrope, someone bitter, closed, who had given up on human warmth. But Thoreau was not lonely at Walden. He was found there. He was finally, completely himself there. He wasn't rejecting the world. He was insisting on a quality of presence, a quality of being truly met, that the world's surface could rarely offer. And that insistence, quiet, stubborn, unapologetic, is something many of you know intimately. The solitude isn't the problem. The solitude is often the only honest place you have. Now, a distinction worth sitting with carefully. There is a difference between feeling invisible and being invisible. Feeling invisible is an internal experience, often the result of showing only part of yourself, or spending most of your time in environments that cannot hold depth or complexity. Being invisible is an external fact, being genuinely unseen, dismissed, talked over, left out. Sometimes these overlap, but often the people who feel most invisible are not the ones the room has dismissed. They are the ones who have, for very understandable reasons, preemptively hidden. And there is a difference between solitude as sanctuary and solitude as hiding. Solitude as sanctuary is chosen freely. It restores, it clarifies, it gives you back to yourself. Solitude as hiding is reactive. It's where you go not to restore, but to avoid the risk of being seen and found insufficient. Both feel like quiet on the outside, but they produce very different lives over time. The question worth asking, gently, without self-judgment, is which kind of solitude you are mostly living in right now. There is also a difference between connection and performance. Many people who feel invisible have for years been performing connection without actually experiencing it. They show up, they contribute, they are friendly, reliable, present in all the visible ways. But inside, there is a constant low-grade awareness that what's being exchanged is surface, that the actual meeting, the kind where you feel genuinely known, isn't happening. At some point, this distinction stops being abstract and becomes the central question of your social life. Is this connection? Or am I just going through the motions again? And the courage it takes to ask that question honestly, without immediately punishing yourself for it, is greater than most people realize. Here's what becomes possible when you begin to understand all of this clearly. You stop blaming yourself for feeling unfound in environments that were never built for depth. A casual gathering was not designed for the kind of conversation that makes you feel real. A work lunch was not built for the exchange of actual interiority. A family dinner organized around habit, role, and decades of unspoken history is rarely the place where anyone is seen entirely. These environments aren't failures. They aren't evidence that something is wrong with you. They're just not for that kind of meeting. And once you stop expecting depth from surfaces, once you stop walking into shallow water and being angry that you can't swim, something quietly remarkable happens. You stop feeling every single time like something is wrong with you. What becomes possible then is intentionality. Instead of spreading yourself thin across many social obligations and leaving all of them feeling emptier than before, you begin to locate, slowly, carefully, without rushing, the 1, 2, perhaps 3 people with whom something more honest is possible. Not perfect people, not people without their own walls and limitations, but people in whose presence you don't feel the constant pull to edit yourself. People who seem to find your depth interesting rather than inconvenient. People around whom the mask loosens, not because you forced it, but because you finally felt safe enough to let it. Those people exist. They may be rare. Finding them takes time and a certain quality of patience, but they exist. And in the meantime, in the beautiful, legitimate meantime, you practice being found by yourself first. Not as a consolation prize for failing at connection, as a foundation from which real connection eventually becomes possible. You write, not as a chore, but as a conversation with the self that rarely gets to speak in rooms full of people. You walk slowly, without a destination, letting thoughts unspool in the open air without interruption. You read books that reflect your inner world back to you in language you didn't know you'd been searching for, and you feel in those pages the particular relief of being understood by someone who never even knew you existed. These are not substitutes for human connection. They are the conditions under which you become someone who can eventually offer connection, real, unedited, present connection, instead of only performing it. Thoreau also wrote that most people live lives of quiet desperation, but what he observed at Walden, and what I want to offer you here gently, is that the desperation is rarely about the absence of people. It's about the absence of authenticity, the chronic, exhausting distance between who you actually are and how you've learned to live. For people who feel invisible, that distance is often most painful not in solitude, but in company. Because company, for them, is often where the gap between the real self and the performed self is most sharply, most privately felt. Imagine a version of your life, not a perfect version, not a dramatic reinvention, but a gradually more honest one. In that life, you stop apologizing internally for how deeply you feel things. You stop attending every gathering that asks you to be a smaller, more manageable version of yourself. And when you do attend, you do so with clearer eyes about what it is and what it isn't. And you stop expecting it to give you what it was never designed to give. You have perhaps 2 conversations a week that actually go somewhere real, that touch something true, that leave you feeling genuinely met rather than quietly drained. You have solitude, deliberate, chosen, unapologetic, not as the place you retreat to in defeat, but as the place you return to in order to remember who you are. That is not a lonely life. That is a life organized around depth rather than volume, around quality rather than performance, around the quiet dignity of knowing yourself well enough to stop pretending otherwise. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't require you to become someone fundamentally different. It only requires, slowly and with great patience for yourself, that you stop hiding the person you already are. You have spent a long time learning to make yourself visible in ways that still left you feeling invisible. You learned the script. You showed up in the versions the room requested. You translated yourself, again and again, into forms that others could hold more comfortably. And somewhere underneath all of that, patient, intact, quietly waiting, the real version of you never left. It's still there, in the quiet, in the space between performances, in the moments when the door finally closes and you exhale and the mask comes off, not with drama, but with the simple, private relief of being no one but yourself. That self doesn't need to be fixed. It doesn't need to be louder or simpler or more available or easier for the room to digest. It needs, perhaps for the first time, to be found, not by everyone, not by a crowd, not by people who only know the edited version, but by at least one person who can hold the whole of it, starting gently and without rush, with you. And if you've ever wondered whether it's truly possible to be seen by another person, not the functional version, not the edited version, but the whole layered, quietly complicated version of you, that's a different kind of question, one that lives at the intersection of vulnerability and trust, of old wounds and new courage. And it's a question that unfolds, slowly and with care, in the next quiet conversation. Alone Together, a quiet corner of the internet for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections.